All right, great. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. We are going to go over the introduction to the Sunshine State Digital Network Metadata Participation Guidelines. Hopefully by the end of this presentation today, you'll have a better understanding about how to remediate your metadata should you become a participant in the Sunshine State Digital Network as a content contributor or potential sub-hub member or something like that. So my name is Hannah Davis, and I'm the preservation librarian at Florida State University. And I am also a member of the training group, and I'm joined by Alvin Lee.
Hi, my name is Alvin Lee. I'm a recent graduate of USF program in Library Information Science. I have been employed at Florida A&M University for the past 8 years. I am the resource sharing coordinator and also a member of the SSDN training group.
All right, so before we kick off talking about SSDN and the metadata participation guidelines, I'd like to talk about briefly what DPLA is. DPLA, or the Digital Public Library of America, is a metadata aggregator, which means that they don't store any of the content you can find on their site. Contributing organizations share their metadata with DPLA to make their content searchable. DPLA sends users back to the contributing organization's website to view the objects. So there are two different types of contributors that DPLA works directly with. These are content hubs and service hubs. Content hubs are large libraries, museums, archives, or other digital repositories that maintain a direct relationship with DPLA. Content hubs, as a general rule, provide more than 150,000 unique metadata records. Service hubs are state or regional collaborations that aggregate metadata from libraries, archives, museums, and other cultural heritage institutions. So where does SSDN fit into all of this? Well, we are the DPLA service hub for Florida. It means we provide partner metadata to DPLA and offer tiered services to partners. We have shared nearly 205,000 records to date, which is great. We are also a network. We have, we're taking a new approach to collaborative digital library work in Florida. We work collaboratively and share resources among sub-hubs and content contributors. We also currently have 56 working group members representing 36 different institutions working to promote, train, and create standards. So Florida State University, University of Miami, and Florida International University were our initial hub implementation leads. And we also have a strong partnership with the Division of Library and Information Services. So how does the SSDN structure work? Well, SSDN is built on a multi-hub structure within the state. The administrative and primary hub is FSU. FSU administers the funds for the network, packages all of the harvested metadata, and handles the direct communication between DPLA and Florida contributors. The University of Miami and Florida International University serve together as the South Florida hub. They work together and serve our contributors in their region. FIU hosts many collections for smaller organizations and conducts outreach within the Southeast Florida area to create awareness of SSDN. handles much of the metadata remediation and packaging, and sends this information to FSU. So that was just a brief overview of SSDN. So now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of it, which, please let me change, Scott. Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and get into the SSDN metadata participation guidelines. Hi, sorry for the technical difficulty. Just a moment. Okay, so this document provides guidance for libraries, archives, and museums who wish to contribute their metadata to the Digital Public Library of America through the Sunshine State Digital Network. These guidelines are intended to help potential and current partners create, enhance, and map their metadata records for contribution to DPLA. So these are not meant to just replace any local metadata guidelines or standards your institution may use already, but can provide suggestions and advice for revisiting those documents to enhance the metadata you are currently creating and also meet SSDN requirements. So these guidelines are meant to be useful to all institutions, regardless of size, current metadata reformatting, or current access systems. There's a link to the guidelines on this slide and the final slide in the deck, which will be provided after the webinar. And now Alvin's going to talk a little bit about metadata mapping and its requirements.
When doing metadata for DPLA, it is very important that you try to be as granular as possible. There are certain elements that are required and certain elements that are recommended. For example, the title is required. The Dublin core would be DC:title. And if you're doing mods in the brackets, you'll do title information, title info, and also title. Creator is recommended. The date is also recommended. And description is optional. But as I said earlier, you want to try to be as granular as possible so that someone who's looking at an object or looking at your metadata can actually tell what the object is without seeing the object itself. Okay. Other required and recommended elements include rights statements, title, and also you want to show a link to the object as well. Recommended elements include contributor, creator, date, format, geographic coverage, language, preview, subject, and type. Optional elements include an alternate title, collection, description, extent, identifier, publisher, relation, replace by, replaces, and rights holder. Also required, which were added by SSDN Hub, is the data provider, the intermediate provider, and the provider. And here your data provider is the person providing the data. The intermediate provider is the person who is then taking that information, and your provider is the person that of the object itself. For example, one of the things that we do is to ingest our College of Agriculture and Food Sciences magazines each month. The provider then would be the College of Agriculture and Food Sciences, and the provider would be the university itself. And since we're doing the digitization of it, the library then becomes the data provider. There are certain elements that are automatically supplied by SSDN. SSDN supplies required elements such as the data provider. This is the organization or the entity that supplies the data to DPLA. Your intermediate provider, if applicable, and here an intermediate organization that selects, collates, and curates data from a data provider that is then aggregated by a provider from which DPLA harvests. And the provider would be your service or content hub aggregating or providing access to the data provider's content, and it may contain the same value as the data provider. So in the example here, the provider is the Sunshine State Digital Network, as well as the Monroe County Public Library. Okay, the intermediate provider, which is not displayed, would be Florida International University, because they are the organization that has selected, collates, and they're curating the data from both the Sunshine State Digital Network and the Monroe County Public Library, which is then going to be harvested into DPLA. There are also system-generated elements, and it's shown as an unambiguous URL reference to digital object in its full information context. In other words, a link to view the item in your system. And then we have the preview, which is a URL of a thumbnail, extract, or other type of resource representing the digital object for the purposes of providing a preview. Here, the thumbnail of the picture showing hurricane damage to Garrison Beach in Key West is actually the preview, and your URL is in the bottom that gives you the site where you can actually go and see that particular thumbnail. Okay, and here we look at some of the elements here as far as Dublin Core. This is a picture from Camp Biscayne. You see that it has a rights statement because it says that copyright is undetermined. Description written on Verso Camp Biscayne Cottage, number 6, Banyan. Okay, and we'll see that the partner is the Sunshine State Digital Network. The contributing institution here is the University of Miami Libraries. Subjects, Ralph Monroe, winter resorts, cottages, or dwellings. Location, Coconut Grove in Miami, Florida. Type is an image. Format is a photograph. And language is image, and you have a URL, and there is a standard rights statement down at the bottom. You want to make sure that you're actually putting those rights statements in as you go along. Just as an aside, that's one of the projects that I'm working on now, because prior to me taking over the digital repository that we have here, objects were put out without rights statements. And so I'm having to go back now and do rights statements for each of those objects. So it's a lot easier to do it as you go along than to have somebody come back later on and do all of them at one time. So the Dublin Core elements are your title. DPLA element is the provider. Again, the DPLA element would be the data provider. Dublin Core element is a description. Where you see DC, it's Dublin Core. The subjects are all Dublin Core elements. The type is also a Dublin Core element. Format and language. The DPLA element here is the URL and also the preview. And another Dublin Core element would be your rights statement. Okay, this thumbnail is one of Florida State baseball from 1981 at Florida State University. So again, here's the thumbnail. It has a mods title because you see title info/title Florida State baseball of 1981. The DPLA elements are the provider and the data provider, being both the provider being Sunshine State Digital Network and the data provider being Florida State University Libraries. The mods element here is name or part name, Florida State University. Mods type of resource would be text. And mods, you have a genre, which is actually a program or a publication. And again, it's in the annual reports, which is another mods genre. And other mods element includes original info, date of issue, original info publisher, language terms, and here the mods element, instead of being a right statement, is called access condition. And the DPLA element here is the PURL.
All right, so now we're going to go ahead and start talking about specific elements and recommendations for how to best prepare these elements for sharing to an aggregator like DPLA. So not all of the elements we will be covering are required, but they are recommended and are often useful for conducting searches and filtering results. So one of our first elements is the title, which is required and repeatable. With cultural heritage materials, we often have to create titles for objects. So no handy title page when you have digital stuff. So good titles are unique, descriptive, and not dependent on context. A good way to approach creating a title is if someone doesn't know anything about this item or the collection that it comes from, will the title help them understand it? Remember that in the context of an aggregator like DPLA, users might not know anything else about the material or the collection that it comes from. So the title is the first thing that gives them any indication what the item is and why they should look at it. Also, in creating a title, avoid using unnecessary punctuation, such as brackets, periods, or quotation marks. This causes the search results to become confusing when sorting. Metadata content standards can provide guidance on how to create titles such as RDA, DAX, or cataloging cultural objects. So, as you can see on the slide, we have on the left-hand side, recommended titles versus not recommended titles. So the titles on the left provide useful information about the item. A user can get a sense of what the item is without knowing anything else about it. So the first example we have in the top left-hand corner, Memphis World, under Rights Act restaurant says 2 menus used. That's a lot more useful than something just called postcards. So the titles on the right are too general and don't provide enough information about the item. Sometimes with cultural heritage materials, such as archival or museum materials, it's impossible to give every item its own description. Whenever possible, it's best to provide unique descriptive titles. Just a fun fact, I don't know if this is fun for y'all, but it is interesting. As of early February 2019, over 90,000 items in DPLA still have the title Untitled, and over 11,000 objects have the title No Title. So that's over 100,000 objects with no useful title information to help users find them and know why they should even click on them. Another element is the description element. It's highly recommended field, but is not required. It complements the title field as it allows you to include more specific descriptive information about the resource. And it may not be necessary or appropriate to include in the title field. The description should only include information about the specific item and not its creator, collection it belongs to, or be a full text transcription of the resource. This element is also repeatable, which allows for you to share only the relevant description field with an aggregator like DPLA, but also share with other relevant details about the resource. But remember that your local labels, like table of contents for elements, do not transfer to DPLA, So make sure that you add context when appropriate. So here's an example. This provides context about what the resource depicts as well as what is written on the back of the photograph. So the aboutness of the photograph, rather than the physical description, the dimensions, or other physical characteristics of the photograph. It is also brief and to the point, as you do not want to provide extraneous or unnecessary information in this field. So yeah, this has pretty great descriptive information, but it's not overwhelming. Let's see, yeah. And so now Alvin's going to talk about dates.
It's very important that you are being consistent in choosing your format for your dates. You want to use the date that the original resource was created, not the date that the item was digitized. Okay, if you have more than one date in your local system, such as the digitization date and acquisition date, only the date of the original resource should be mapped in the field for objects going into DPLA. You want to avoid using placeholders such as unknown. If possible, include a date range or approximate date. If no date is known, it's best to leave that field blank. You can also use the ISO 8601 standard, which is your year, month, date. Good examples would be 1904, June 20th, or a range between 1860, 1869. And again, consistency is the key. Here's some different date formats. Look at the ones on the left as compared to the ones on the right. October 1st, 1991, as opposed to circa June 19th, 1901. CA 1920 or CA June 19th, 1901. 2016, 06, 08 by CAD. Again, you want to be consistent. You want to make sure that you're choosing the actual date the object was created. You have unknown 1853, 1875, circa between 1908, November 19th, or 2001 or 2002, and 1919 question mark. You don't want to use stuff like 20th century, okay, because that's too wide of a range. Or listing dates such as 1920 through 1929, rather than doing the range of 2001 to 1920 through 1929. So these are just examples of some good date formats and date formats that you want to kind of stay away from, especially the scanned and processed one. That's one thing that we don't want to do. You want to use the date that the actual item was created, not the date that you scanned or processed it. And again, consistency is the key. You'll find that if you just go through and be consistent, it makes your life a lot easier. It also makes ingestion of the objects a lot easier as well.
So I just got a question in the chat box. How does DPLA want circuit dates to be written? There are lots of possibilities. You are correct. There are a lot of possibilities. DPLA would prefer to give a range of years instead of using circa, CA, CE. So just like, I'm going to go back. So in our examples, we have all of these are within ISO standard. So yeah, we prefer a range of years opposed to a circa date. All right, so now we're coming up on, what about using 1940s, for example, to denote the decade as possible? No, it would be preferable to use 1940 through 1949. That it just kind of relieves, it's just easier for things to be sorted than various versions of circa. So yeah, use a date range instead of circa. All right, so now we're coming up on rights. So right statements are required and repeatable. Right statements are required for participation in SSDN. Ideally, a standardized right statement, which offer both human and machine readable formats. Using machine readable right statements enable DPLA to automatically provide more information about the rights of objects and ensures consistency and uniformity. For example, including standardized right statements makes it possible for DPLA to easily display logos that show the right status of an item, such as this logo, which you can see on the bottom of the slide, showing that this photo is out of copyright in the United States. Additionally, it makes it easier for users to quickly identify how that item can or cannot be reused, unlike many local statements which do not usually provide clear reuse information and can vary from each other. A sample of 1.3 million DPLA records revealed 26,000 unique right statements. That is a lot of unique right statements. There are over 30 million objects in DPLA, so you can imagine how many more there actually are. Copyright and reuse can be complicated topics for users to grapple with. So let's not make it any harder for our users. So both Creative Commons and rightstatements.org provide a machine readable URI. Here's an example from rightstatement.org. In addition to a standardized rights URI, a local free text rights field can also be included in your mapping. However, this should not contradict or simply repeat the standardized rights statements. Many institutions use different fields in their local repositories for standardized and local rights fields. If you do this, map them both to DC rights or mods access condition for sharing with SSDN, and SSDN will separate the URI from the local rights field. If your system cannot make use of a URI like DPLA's site can, you can have the standardized rights language in an additional field to display to users on your site, in addition to the field with the URI, but do not map the human readable field for sharing. And we had a question about, does DPLA prefer rightstatements.org? I don't know if there's necessarily a preference, but we in SSDN have been using that a lot for our harvests. So it's a really great website. So so that doesn't necessarily answer your question, but rightstatement.org is great. So start there for your right statements. So to include both a standardized rights URI and a local right statement, put in your record 2 instances of the same element, such as DC rights or mods access condition. The element with the URI should come first. So rights statement implementation can vary by system, and SSDN is happy to help discuss the best ways to implement it with your materials. Are there any more questions about right statements before we move on to type? All right, okay, so now Alvin's gonna talk about the type element. All right, so type. The type is nature or genre of the described resource using a limited set of controlled vocabulary to describe your items. So we link to some available vocabularies on this slide for you. Type is recommended and not repeatable. It's useful for faceting search results. And you can see on the right-hand side of this slide that there are various facets of type that users can narrow their searches with. If you want more granular values of type, so like book, photograph, you will need to use the format element, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So if you think about how users understand things, like when you scan a page of a book, technically it is an image, but to most users, they will think of it as text. So I mentioned before that if you want more granular type, format is the way to go. This description of the type of object gives you more than a simple vocabulary used than type. It can encompass description of the medium, materials, genre, or other similar terms. Format is recommended and repeatable. There are a variety of controlled vocabularies out there for use for format. They're included in this slide. Some of them include the art and architecture thesaurus, thesaurus for graphic materials, and so on. As SSDN and DPLA use this element, it refers to the original object, not the file type of the digital surrogate. Many institutions use format to record that the digital object is, for example, a TIFF image or a PDF. If your metadata includes that information, do not map it for sharing with SSDN. Users interact with your materials thinking of photographs, not of TIFFs. So here's an example of type and format in some materials pulled from DPLA. So in our first example, the Vinales Valley of Pinar del Rio, the type is image, but the format is a photograph or landscape photograph. We also have in here the Tarpon Club synchronized swimming performance clips, which the type is moving image, but the format is short film. So you can see where type is a broad description of what the object is. Format gets you that more granular description. So now Alvin's going to talk about geographic coverage.
Okay, and we're thinking about geographic coverage. Think about your spatial characteristics of the described resource. Geographical coverage is recommended and it is repeatable. It is displayed as location in Digital Public Libraries of America. You want to use this to describe spatial aboutness, not the location of publication or digitization. It can be a country, city, a region, an address, or other geographical term. Some of the controlled vocabularies: geonames, thesaurus for geographic names, Library of Congress name authority file, subject headings, and then FAST. You can also use local or regional control list if available.
And I just wanted to add about geographic coverage. This element is really useful for those using the API, where you can use this data to populate maps, create augmented reality apps, or other types of things where geographic information is useful.
And here we have two examples. Your title, 88 LaGrosse Circle, Miami Beach, Florida, 33140. Location, Miami Beach, Miami-Dade County, Florida, which is inhabited place. And your second example here, the title is 1907 Whitehead Street. Location being Florida, Key West, Florida, Monroe County, Florida.
All right, so now that we are all metadata experts, let's practice with a couple of sample records. So our first metadata activity, go ahead and take a look at the provided metadata fields and identify the required fields. Please share your responses with the group in the chat box, and we'll take a couple minutes to do that. All right, I think we got them all. So the only elements here that are required by SSDN are the data provider. Provider is shown at title, and oh, we missed the rights statement. So that's important to remember. So the data provider and provider are added by SSDN during the harvesting process. A link to the item is provided by the repository system. So the only elements that the institution is required to create are title and rights. Of course, many of these other elements are very valuable and make this a stronger metadata record. Type, subject, language, and creator are all recommended elements by SSDN. So it's great that those are included in this particular example. So our next metadata activity are to suggest improvements to this record to make it more useful to the end user in DPLA using the SSDN metadata guidelines outlined earlier in the presentation. So if y'all want to go ahead and enter those into the chat box, we'll give it another minute or two. All right, these are excellent, excellent suggestions. So here's some suggested improvements, which don't include all of the excellent improvements that everyone else made. So yeah, that's excellent. All right, well, we're actually coming up to the end of our webinar this afternoon. you guys all had really great suggestions for improvements to this record. So I think that concludes our activities section, and also concludes the webinar for this afternoon. If anyone has any questions, we can use the next few minutes to answer anything you may have to ask. You allow many different subject formats, AAT, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't that mean that the records aren't tied together? I don't know if I exactly understand your question. Is there any context you can maybe provide to that? Yes, in DPLA, they will all come up if it's cars. So yeah, to answer Jordan's question, the records will be tied together. Despite having various vocabularies, all of those will be aggregated on DPLA, and so all of those search terms will come up in searches and faceting. So yes, they will be linked to the vocabulary. Mark had a question about when you say repeatable, what exactly do you mean using different schemes? DC or DPLA, what do you mean that multiple names can be used? So, for example, if you have a photograph that, so you wouldn't have multiple dates for a photograph. You would either have a specific date or the time range. But you may have repeatable locations about the object. So I'm actually going to go ahead and run this back. So in like geographic coverage, if you look at the right-hand photograph on here, the location has multiple terms. So it's Florida and Key West and Monroe County. So that's what it means when an element can be repeated. Yes, the participation guidelines are posted on the website, which is sunshinestatedigitalnetwork.wordpress.com, which is at the bottom of this slide. Let's see, would you recommend creating a title or using the title provided on an envelope that a photograph came with? Ooh, that's a good question. And there are better people to answer that than me, which if you take a deep dive into the participation guidelines on the website, there may be more illuminating answers for you.
Hannah, I can give you an example of that.
There we go.
One of the things that we came across were a box of photographs from the local cooperative extension office that's tied in with the university here. And it just said cooperative extension pictures. Well, after doing some further research, the actual picture that I was looking at was actually one of the initial meeting for the start of the North Florida Farmers Cooperative. And so we decided rather than just go with the cooperative extension photo, we went with North Florida Farmers Cooperative inaugural meeting. So there are times if you can do some research, you may come up with a better name than what's on the photograph.
Did that help answer your question a little better? What if you can't read the title on the envelope? Isn't that just every archives? I think that in that instance, just give it the best title or description that you can. And even if it's not necessarily exactly what is on the envelope, giving it as much context as you can will help it be searchable. We have another question. Since titles are required, we have been instructed to be a bit more wordy in titles. So the titles may sound more like descriptions, good, bad. If I think I'm understanding this correctly, actually, Teresa, if you wouldn't mind providing more context for your question, that would be helpful. Well, yeah, since titles are required, well, possibly your titles are descriptions. That I can't comment on that, but maybe I think actually just looking at the metadata guidelines on the SSDN website may provide more insight to that, or taking a look at one of these thesauri about describing your information or your materials. But yeah, does DPLA do keyword search on the titles? Yes, it does. So does anyone have any other questions? We have a few more minutes. If not, please feel free to contact us through our website, sunshinestateDigitalNetwork.org. Again, that is where the SSDN Metadata Participation Guidelines are located. If you are having any issues or have any questions about what these metadata guidelines will look like for your institution, please feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to work with you in making your metadata the best metadata that it can be. So if there are no more questions, I think that will conclude our webinar today. Thank you again for joining us. It's been a wonderful time.